Chapter 8 Rock Barrage. The sunlight streaming into the hermit's cabin was suddenly blocked off by the stocky figure of Sheriff Ecker. "Morning, Donner," he said as the tall man came forward with his hand outstretched. "Sorry to break in, but we're going to need your help." By this time, Frank, Joe, and Chet had come from the kitchen. "Oh, the boys found you first, did they?" The sheriff spoke in a gruff but friendly voice. He was dressed for the wilderness in high-top boots and a sturdy belt from which hung a heavy revolver in its holster. 3 men were standing together behind the sheriff. "Well, here's your search party," Ecker said to Joe. "It's not much of a posse. 3 men are all I can spare, but we'll do what we can. With what you fellows and Donner here, we'll have 8, and that's pretty good. Sorry I couldn't get a hold of a good dog to take along." "That's all right, Sheriff," Chet spoke up. "We have Mystery." "Our beagle," Joe explained hastily. "Search party?" repeated Donner. "That sounds terribly official to me, Sheriff." Sheriff Ecker shot a quick look up at the smiling Donner. "Did the boys tell you what's up?" "Well, they did say something about their captain friend being missing. He probably just went for a long hike in the woods. I'd no idea it was so important that the sheriff personally would lead a search party in these out-of-the-way parts," he added, smiling. Sheriff Ecker frowned, obviously reminded of other urgent matters. Joe and Frank glanced at each other. Would the man change his mind about conducting the search? But Ecker merely said, "I'd like you to come along, Mr. Donner, since you know the hollow so well." "By all means," agreed the big man. "But now that you're here, come in and have a look at my little retreat, Sheriff. It's over 100 years old. I was just telling the boys that it used to be a hideout for runaway slaves." Hospitably, Donner conducted Ecker through the cabin while the boys waited. Joe went to introduce himself to the 3 deputies. Chet, meanwhile, accompanied by their frisky young puppy, wandered over to the 3-cornered sheep pen and peered inside. Frank stayed near the door of Donner's house. He stared thoughtfully at the ground. Something shiny that lay deep in the tall meadow grass caught his eye. Unobserved by the others, he stooped down, examined the object, and slipped it into his pocket, just before Donner and the sheriff appeared. "Ready to go, boys?" Donner boomed. Their group now formed under his direction. Donner had put on a dapper felt hat with bright-colored trout flies hooked on the band. With an amused grin, he was stuffing a long-barreled target pistol with a fancy pearl handle into his belt. "Now I feel like a real deputy," he joked. Frank and Chet took their places with Joe. "Now, my husky young friend," Donner went on, gripping Chet's shoulder, "suppose you come up front with your dog? Black Hollow has 2 kinds of terrain, woods on the bottom and rock on the sides. We'll take the woods first and the rocks later." Quickly the searchers were told by Sheriff Ecker to fan out, in order to cover as much ground as possible. Each person was to keep the man on the right of him in plain sight, and was responsible for the area between them. Chet, with Mystery, eagerly sniffing and straining at his homemade leash, was placed near the center, slightly in advance of the rest. Sheriff Ecker stationed himself on the left wing, and Frank and Joe to the extreme right. Donner took the middle so he could call all directions. In this order the party advanced into the thick woods on the hunt for Captain Maguire. The tangled undergrowth, the dim light, and the numerous trees growing densely together made the progress difficult and slow. "Sheriff," Donner called out, "there's a little gully over near you. Check it. Maguire may have fallen into it." In a minute the report came back. "Nobody there." Another time the woodsman sang out jokingly, "You, Joe Hardy. You'll be coming to a hollow tree. Better look inside and see if your friend's inside." Joe smiled faintly, but he was beginning to be annoyed at Donner's rather light-hearted approach to the affair. "Treats the whole thing like a lark," the young sleuth thought. All the while his keen eyes scanned the ground. Bushes and heavy undergrowth. Frank and Chet were almost constantly on the alert. The search continued through the gloomy hollow. All at once, Mystery gave a high-pitched yap at something that had startled him. "A man!" Chet shouted. "I see a body!" From both sides, the searchers came pounding toward him. All stared ahead into the dark woods. Ahead lay the huddled figure of a man in a black coat and cap and gray trousers. Tensely, with Mystery bounding along, they pressed forward. Frank and Joe were the first to reach the figure. Both gasped in relief. "It's only a fallen tree limb," Joe exclaimed as the others came up. "Some eyes you've got, Morton," Donner roared. The deputies shook their heads, half amused, half exasperated. "Well, it looked like a body from far away," Chet apologized ruefully. "Might as well call a halt and rest now that we're all together," Sheriff Ecker interposed. Eager to make amends, Chet opened his knapsack and passed around tuna fish, egg salad, and ham and cheese sandwiches. The three deputies sat on the tree limb that had fooled Chet. Frank, Joe, and the sheriff squatted on their heels while Donner lounged against a tree. "It's noon, but you'd never know it in these dark woods," Sheriff Ecker commented. While Chet went from man to man with a big thermos of coffee, Frank brought the tiny transistor radio from his pocket and turned it on to the 12 o'clock news. The swift, precise voice of the announcer roused the search party's attention. New Jersey and Pennsylvania State Police were forced to admit defeat this morning in their attempt to recover thousands of dollars worth of surgical equipment stolen last night from a truck en route to New Jersey. Daring hijackers stopped the tractor-trailer carrying the equipment, knocked the driver unconscious, and apparently fled in a vehicle of their own. No trace of them has been discovered. Frank and Joe exchanged meaningful glances. This news indicated that their father's work on the case was far from finished. Officials emphasized, the broadcaster continued, that this robbery was only the latest in a series of many which have taken place in the area recently. Combined efforts of law enforcement agencies in both states to round up the hijackers have so far ended in total failure. "Turn it off," the sheriff snapped. Donner, however, merely chuckled and shook his head with amusement. "Now, isn't that just like our state police?" he said. "Just don't want to work overtime, probably. No wonder they can't keep up with these hijackers. When thieves are on a job, they don't worry about the hours." "Now, Sheriff, you tell me," the big man went on. "Why aren't these criminals caught? All it would take, it seems to me, is a system of alerting all policemen within a reasonable radius and posting them on all possible escape routes." "Mr. Donner, I know you mean well," answered Ecker, frowning. "But you're hitting kind of close to home. I was out all night myself, and my men were too. We were out the night before that, and I'd be watching the roads right now if I wasn't here, searching for this man who's disappeared. A policeman can't do two things at once, you know. No more than any other man." "You're right, Sheriff, and I'm sorry," Walter Donner apologized. "Let's finish this search." Accordingly, the party spread out in a line again, and the hunt went on. By mid-afternoon, the searchers had thoroughly combed the wooded valley floor without discovering a clue to Captain Maguire's whereabouts. Now they found themselves up against a steep, rocky side of a hollow. "I see a cave up there," said Donner, pointing above the ledges and boulders. It's just possible we may find something in it. You boys go on ahead, I'll come up after you. I'm not in very good condition for climbing." In a moment, Joe Hardy was working his way nimbly up the gray rock wall. Frank and Chet followed close behind. Above them, the cave mouth was a black opening in the rocks. Soon Joe reached a narrow ledge, about a third of the way up. As he pulled himself onto it, however, he was suddenly staggered by a stone that crashed into his forehead. "Look out! Above you!" Donner shouted. Other stones came bounding down at the climbing boys, narrowly missing them. Looking up, they saw a tall, lean figure at the top of the hollow. He kept hurling the dangerous missiles. "It's Simon!" cried Donner. "Watch out!" The mute boy waved his arms threateningly. "He's trying to stop us from coming up," Joe said grimly. "Well, he's not going to succeed." Although his head was bleeding, the plucky boy crawled upward again, after Frank, who was now in the lead. Chet was climbing at a slower pace behind them. Seeing the trio advance, the strange boy redoubled his barrage. One stone bruised Frank's forearm. Another skipped off his back. Dodging, the determined boy crawled steadily upward. He reached the ledge at the mouth of the cave, and then he turned. With a skillful pull and twist, he hauled his brother up beside him. Abruptly, the stoning ceased. Frank and Joe turned to face the cave itself. In the next instant, they froze in their tracks. Barely 3 feet from their faces, a deadly timber rattler was coiling to strike. At that moment, 2 more of the venomous snakes slithered out of the cave itself. End of Chapter 8.